helping people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformation with Michael Hart, award-winning psychotherapist, author, and Canadian certified counselor.
Welcome to the Life Transformation Show. Today we will continue with part 2 of our impactful series on psychological abuse in marriage. In today's episode, we will be discussing the early warning signs, the impact, and what to do if you're a victim of psychological abuse. Remember, psychological abuse doesn't always show up as shouting or slamming doors. It often arrives in disguises. Joining us once again to unpack this critical topic is award-winning psychotherapist and author Michael Hart. Michael is also the founder of Elim Counseling Services, a faith-based ministry dedicated to restoring emotional and spiritual health through professional counseling and biblical guidance. You can learn more about us at elimcounselingministry.com, and you can also make a tax-receivable donation through Elim Mental Health Foundation. So, have you ever felt like you're walking on eggshells in your marriage, or constantly questioning your own thoughts and feelings? Well, this conversation could be the first step toward clarity and healing. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Denise. This topic is so important because psychological abuse often hides in plain sight. Many people who are suffering in silence, unaware that what they're experiencing is a form of abuse. Our goal today, Denise, as we go through this show, is to shine a light on those hidden patterns and help people move towards healing, helping them to see the devastating effects of psychological abuse, but also to give them those first steps of what they can do if they are in a relationship where they are being abused. So I would encourage you, if you missed the first episode, part 1 of this series, you can find it on our YouTube channel because we did cover some important principles like the definition of psychological abuse and so forth. So be sure to listen to the part 1 as well.
Absolutely, Michael. So last week, we started to touch on some of those early warning signs, but we simply didn't have enough time to do the topic justice. So today, I'd love for us to pick up where we left off. Let's begin with this. What are some early warning signs that someone might be in an emotionally abusive marriage?
Well, we touched on things briefly last week, such as feeling as if you're constantly walking on eggshell. Another thing that we touched on briefly last week was this constant second guessing of yourself. Abusers frequently twist facts, deny past conversations, or blame you for misunderstanding things when in fact they're the one who are guilty of behaving in inappropriate way. So this often leads to confusion, it leads to self-doubt and a loss of trust in your own perception. If you have been in this kind of relationship for a while, this will begin to get worse and eventually you will doubt your perception altogether. You can actually get to a point where you begin to define what is right or wrong based on what your partner decides. So the Bible becomes no longer your guide, or common sense becomes no longer your guide, but you are acting out of what the person or psychologically abusing you determine is right. So another sign is that you're often feeling as if you are being blamed for things that are not your fault. Even when the abuser is clearly in the wrong, they redirect the blame to you And over time, you will find yourself beginning to internalize the guilt and to feel responsible for the problems in the relationships. Another common early warning sign is dismissal of your feelings and you being accused of being too sensitive. So abusers minimize or mock partners' emotional responses and create a dynamic where the victim often distrusts their own feelings.
So, Michael, I've heard so many survivors say, maybe I was overreacting. But in reality, they were trained to believe their pain wasn't valid. So can you give some guidance on this?
Absolutely. So when you're in a relationship where you're constantly made to second guess yourself, eventually you start feeling as if what the other person is telling you is right. And you start thinking, maybe what they said to me, maybe they called me derogatory names, but maybe I'm just too sensitive the way that I am behaving. And over time, you begin to doubt yourself and start questioning whether or not the way you're reacting is really a valid way of reacting. So what I often suggest to my clients is that you should open up to third parties, ask questions of supportive people in your life about, do you think I am overreacting when this was said to me and I reacted in that way? And what many of my clients will come back and say, when I speak to my friends about it, they say that they would react the same or even more intensely if they're in the same situation. Another early warning sign is losing your confidence and becoming dependent on the abuser's approval. So you may have been very good at something, and eventually over time, you begin to lose your confidence in something that you are good at and that you have always excelled in. The person managed to repeatedly criticize you or act in sarcastic way. And so over time, this erodes your self-esteem, making you feel incapable and as if you are not capable of something that you're really good at. So what this is doing is that it is allowing you to lose your confidence so that you may now have to look to that person as a guide or as a reference before you can do or act in ways that came naturally to you and in things that you're actually competent in. I remember one of my clients many years ago told me how that before she met her husband, she was a very good driver. But because of repeated criticism over a period of 30 years, she came to a point where she felt as if she could not drive anymore. And so it wasn't until she was out of the relationship that she was able to get her confidence to drive again. Another sign would be being made to doubt the loyalty of friends and family. And so we talked in part 1 about how abusers seek to isolate the victim. So abusers often will say things like, your friends don't really care about you, or your family just wants to control you. And over time, what this does is that it isolates the victim and it increases the dependence on the abuser. The victim is put in a situation where they are now feeling as if the only person I have in my universe who really cares and is concerned about me is my abuser. And so they will not see the person as an abuser. They will see the person as their only source of care and love and direction. But this is a a manipulation tactic that is meant to isolate you and to make you depend solely on them. And so this is a very powerful strategy, because what it does is that it isolates you from getting opinion and references from others. And so what happens over time is that your reality becomes dependent on what that person says. And this is what I meant earlier when I said your sense of right and wrong become confused to a point where your reference as what's right and what's wrong becomes what that person says. It's no longer morality, it's no longer the Bible, it's no longer societal norms, but it's what this person determines it to be. And I've seen that it's over the years bizarre circumstances where even infidelity were seen as being right because the person said it was no big deal. The abuser said it was no big deal. And so Dr. Evan Stark, a psychologist, refers to this dynamic as coercive control. And this is where the emotional abuse is used to dominate every aspect of the victim's life. And so another early sign would be subtle control over finances, over social interactions, or decision making. And this makes you feel incapacitated, as we have said before. Another sign would be this person has the tendency to make mountains out of molehill. There might have been a minor disagreement, but these minor disagreements are blown out of proportion, leaving you constantly apologizing or trying to make amends.
So, Michael, those are really subtle but powerful tactic you just described. It keeps the victim in a state of unrest, constantly questioning what they did wrong. So, what other insight can you give such a person?
Yes, another common tactic would be the silent treatment as a means of control. So, in this example that we talk about making a molehill into a mountain, if you don't agree that something is of the magnitude that they say it is, then they will suddenly withdraw from you. They will become silent. They'll give you the silent treatment. But the silent treatment is a means of control. So until you agree with their perspective, until you agree that this is a big deal, they will withhold, they will be silent, and the silence is used as a way of punishing you. Psychologist John Gottman refers to this as stone walling. And another way is by withholding love and affection. Well, I guess that's part of the silent treatment as well. Mm-hmm. If they're silent and they're not talking to you, then they're withholding their love and affection. And over time, you feel punished and you give in to the demands that they're putting on you to see things their way. Another common strategy or something that we see early in relationship that you should pay attention to if you're seeing this in someone you're dating is that they use sarcastic and demeaning jokes. So the abuser uses humor to disguise insults. So they're really insulting you, but they're doing it in the form of jokes. And it will be followed by phrases like, can't you just take a joke? Why are you so thin-skinned? And you are now beginning to think, maybe I am thin-skinned. Maybe this was just really a joke. But it happens so frequently when you're in the company of others that you often feel insulted and incapable and not good enough. And this kind of behavior is a means of breaking down your self-confidence, eroding your self-esteem, and making you more feel inferior to them. And so Proverbs 26:18-19 says, like a maniac shooting flaming arrows of death is one who deceives their neighbors and say, I was only joking. So this passage clearly condemns sarcasm and jest used to harm others under the disguise of humor.
So, Michael, yes, definitely that verse really hits home because God sees the intent behind words, even when they are disguised as jokes. So it's comforting to know that scripture validates what victims experience. Correct?
Absolutely. I think the Bible is really ahead of its time, and that should be no surprise to us as Christians. We believe it is the word of God, but we see that a lot of things that psychologists talks about as being damaging or as being psychologically harmful, that the Bible also says the same thing. But before we leave this question, there's one last thing that I would like to mention about the subtle ways in which it shows up earlier on in the relationship. So if you're in a relationship where the abuser may invalidate your emotions by indicating how you should feel or respond to situation, you may be in an abusive relationship. For example, they might criticize you for not realizing that someone was insulting or demeaning you. So you may have been in a social situation where you know your friends, you know your family members, and this is no big deal to you. But the abuser convinces you that you were being demeaned, you're being insulted, and this implies that your ability to feel is not as it should be, that there is something wrong with you. And this tactic confuses your emotional compass, and it undermines your ability to trust your own instinct. So over time, you begin to rely on the person, the abuser, to tell you how you should feel about situations. And what will end up happening is that things that didn't bother you before suddenly becomes a big issue. Why? Because over time, they have inculcated in your brain that the way you were reacting previously to meeting them was not appropriate. And so you are now made to feel that you should depend on them to be a guide to your emotions as to what you should feel.
So, Michael, that really sounds like such a subtle form of gaslighting. You know, it turns that the victim's own emotions against them and makes them feel foolish for not reacting the right way. It's incredible disorienting.
Absolutely. I can just understand what it must feel like to be in a situation like that where you can't even trust your own emotions anymore. According to Dr. Lenore Walker, he discusses this under a topic called the cycle of abuse theory. And what he said is victims may experience tension building phases where they constantly try to appease their partner to avoid emotional punishment. And that over time, this pattern conditions the victim into a state of learned helplessness. So this constant tension in the relationship renders the person in a stage where they feel helpless to think for themselves. They feel helpless to determine what is right or wrong, and they're totally dependent on the other person. Proverbs 26:24 and 25 said, enemies disguise themselves with their lips, but in their heart they harbor deceit. Though their speech is charming, do not believe them. Abusers often mask their control with charm and false promises, making it difficult for victims to recognize the harm. You may feel that this person is the only person who cares for you, the only person you can trust, but this is often a disguise.
So, Michael, what I'm hearing you say is that psychological abuse often begins subtly, making it difficult for victims to recognize until they are deeply affected. So that makes these warning signs so important to notice early. So what is the long-term impact of psychological abuse?
That's such a good question, Denise, and we should look at that. I think that's an appropriate topic for us to look at, because we often make the mistake to think that if you're in a relationship where the person is not hitting you, it can't be that bad. But victims of psychological abuse often experience depression, they experience anxiety, they often have PTSD symptoms and a loss of self-worth. So according to Dr. Christine Corters, she said that prolonged emotional abuse can lead to complex trauma, a form of psychological distress that affects emotional regulation, relationships, and the self-identity. So this kind of disorientation that a person goes through in these relationships, it's like what soldiers suffer when they come back from the war zone. They have PTSD symptoms. They begin to question the relationship that they have with others, and they lose their self-identity. Victims may struggle with self-doubt, difficulty making decisions, and feelings of worthlessness. And many also develop somatic symptoms such as headache, digestive issues, and chronic pain due to the ongoing emotional distress, even though they didn't have those conditions before meeting their abusers.
So those were very informative information, Michael. So let's move on to what should a victim of psychological abuse do? What are some of the first steps a survivor can take to start healing from this kind of trauma?
I think one of the first things that victims of psychological abuse should do is to recognize the abuse. This is often very confusing for people who are in abusive relationship as they begin to doubt themselves. So it's important to listen to podcasts like these. Go back and listen to part 1, and this will help you to determine if what you're going through is psychological abuse. You are now in a stage, if you've been in this relationship for a while, where you can't trust your own judgment. But if you can listen and learn what psychological abuse is, it can take you from under the darkness that you're under. In Ephesians 5:11, it talks about exposing the deeds of darkness. And knowledge and truth is what exposes the deeds of darkness. The Bible says we shall know the truth, and the truth will make us free.
Michael will be right back. You have been listening to the Life Transformation Show, where award-winning psychotherapist and author Michael Hart of Elim Counseling Services has been speaking on the topic, the impact of psychological abuse in marriage, Part 2. You can find out more about us at elimcounselingministry.com or by calling 613-699-1677 or 1-877-204-2914. Please consider making a tax-receivable donation through Elim Mental Health Foundation. Your donations help us to stay on the air and to provide subsidized counseling to those who can't afford it. Back to Michael.
It's also important, another step that victims should take is that they need to establish clear boundaries. Set clear and firm boundaries with your abusers. So boundaries may include refusing to engage in conversations when they're yelling at you, refusing to be manipulated by the silent treatment, and are saying things like, I will not continue this conversation if you raise your voice or call me names. Or you can impose boundaries by saying, I need space right now. I'll talk when we can both speak respectfully. Or you can say things like, I appreciate your opinion, but you cannot tell me how I should feel or how I should think. Or you could say something like, thank you for your opinion about my friend John, but I have known John for over 20 years, and I know that John did not mean anything harmful by the statement that he made. So all these things are ways of setting boundary. Proverbs 4 verse 23 tells us, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows out of it. So if you do not guard your heart and you allow the abuser to tell you what's right and wrong, how to think, how to feel, then you are not guarding your heart. Another important step to take is to seek spiritual strength. Read the Bible. The Bible is a book that guides you in what's right or wrong. Pray. Prayer helps you to cope and to seek help and strength from God. Spend time with your faith communities, because this protects you from the danger of isolation. Your faith will help you not to live in fear of your abuser and will strengthen you and help you. Isaiah 41:10 says, so do not fear, for I am with you. I will strengthen you and help you. The next step, I think, it's to rebuild your identity and self-worth. Begin to hang around people who can affirm you and who can compliment you and make you feel good about yourself instead of subjecting yourself to the abuser. Educate yourself about abuse. A book that I would recommend is The Emotionally Destructive Relationship by Leslie Vernick. Reading books like those will educate you about this topic. Another good book is Why Does He Do That by Londa Bancroft. And I'm saying that if you begin to read and understand, you will have the tools. Also seek support. The victims should reach out to trusted friends and family members, because when you're in the situation alone and this person is telling you how to think, you lose your moral compass. But if you are around people that can guide you and help you to see that what you're going through is abuse, it will set you free from the trap of abuse. Also consider seeking professional help. Professional help can be a very powerful tool in helping you to overcome psychological abuse.
Well, thank you for all the discussion we have had today, Michael. Jeremiah 30 verse 17 came to mind. I will restore you to health and heal your wounds, declares the Lord. So there's hope for anyone who is going through psychological abuse. So next week, we'll discuss part 3. And you'll be talking about what the church can do to support victims of psychological abuse and how to heal from the deception and manipulation of being in a psychologically abusive relationship. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Remember, the Life Transformation airs every Monday morning at 9:30 a.m. If you missed this episode, you can find it on our YouTube channel at Elim Counseling Services. Donations to support mental health and this ministry can be made to Elim Mental Health Foundation. Until next time, stay strong, stay hopeful, and remember that God is always in the business of restoration. This is your co-host, Denise Hart.
And Michael Hart, praying together that God would bless you in all your relationships and keep you sound in mind and pure in heart.